So hello. Oh, hold on. Remove that. So, I am David Bradley, aka Schizophreniforms, and today, or in this particular video, I'm talking further and to elaborate on something covered in episode 5 of the podcast, which is my concept that I'm trying to develop called Transverbal Synesthetic communication, aka creating the illusion of telepathy as a function of progressive communication in a restorative context in schizophrenic patients or schizophrenia patients after a psychotic episode. Now I'll go further into that, but I'm going to film this sequentially and then glue it all together. So that's the basic gist. Using trance-induced hallucination, hypnosis and mindfulness to reprogram the negative content of a schizophrenic patient's hallucinations and the correlating positive symptoms. Now by positive symptoms I mean hallucinations, delusions, or things that, so rather than say depression or apathy or tiredness or an inability to navigate one's personal maintenance, things like that. These are negative symptoms, as they're technically called, I believe, in psychology. But the positive symptoms, aka hallucinations, visions, sensory tactile feedback of these various components of hallucinatory content. So that's what I mean by positive symptoms after acute psychosis has subsided. So I'm not presenting this as an alternative to traditional medications or treatments or anything like that, but literally as an adjunct, an additional thing that one can do that might possibly help provide post-psychosis or post-extreme sense of the event or extreme moments or extreme sensations, how to then to apply a methodology for reframing the symptoms without avoidance to facilitate personal growth and reintegration of these externalized thoughts and internal processes and dialogues. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So this is my author's preface. I'm just going to read it word for word in the document that I've written. I'm a diagnosed schizophrenia sufferer, and to my mind I've always felt as though I was experiencing something significant psychologically and spiritually. This is a common apprehension of schizophrenics, possibly some might say misapprehension, who knows. However, since gaining ever greater insight into the nature of both my illness and my own psyche, I now feel as though I'm often on the verge of sanity and a kind of profound clarity and integration that I can no longer accept that I have an illness, a true illness. Illness would seem to me would be something that negatively impacts one's life in a debilitating fashion, whereas this is more how I consider it. A disability, however, is a permanent or long-term impediment of the functioning of oneself, both physically or mentally, or both, compared or in comparison to the average human and societal norms. So I'm slightly paraphrasing what's written here now. I've considered myself to be disabled in that, due to my condition, I'm no longer able to interact and behave and indeed enjoy life in the same way as I would be possible were I not to have the experience that are categorized as my disability. So, as a matter of pride and recovery, in a very tangible sense of stubbornness and defiance, I decided to turn my disability into a new ability. Or at least that was the intention. That's the intention of this. The idea was to transmute, to use occult parlance, my curse into a blessing, to reframe and reprogram my hallucinations into a kind of extrasensory feedback system, whereby I was no longer at the whim of said hallucinations, but in fact the progenitor and master of these experiences. And a quick addendum, that was already my experience of these things, was that to a certain extent it was a sensory feedback system. Now, I'm not talking about persecutory voices or the negative content, the unpleasant content of the hallucinations, but there was a huge part of my personal experience that felt like an overload to the senses, like an access to a new part of my psyche which I couldn't mediate, I couldn't manage it, I couldn't develop it, I couldn't do anything useful with it because it was so overwhelming. Back to what I've written. I set in my sights the aim of alchemical/psychological reconstruction with the simple mantra of, if I'm going to have these experiences, I will become the master of them, and then, to use a very personally poignant metaphor, I would make a heaven of my hell. And with relative success and a lot of support from psychotherapists, family, friends and loved ones, I feel I may be nearing my goal. The resulting conclusions and still merely theoretically therapeutic applications of my approach are the basis for the following writing And then I said, I hope you enjoyed reading it, so in this case listening to it, as much as I've enjoyed writing and compiling it. And that was on the 29th of January, February, March, April 2015 I wrote this. So that's the preface. And then next part of the video we're going to be moving into what the process is. And I've gone too long, so I'm going to have to edit it. So, to get into the main bulk of the text, and I just want to start just quickly by saying, not a therapist, not experienced in anything other than my own life. So don't take this as medical advice, don't practice this, don't do anything with it unless you know better than I do, because it's only worked for me because I've been supported heavily. I've been on medications for which are quite powerful and effective for around 8 or so years now. I could probably work that out in a few seconds, but the point still stands. The best part of a decade I've been on these medications. I've had a huge amount of support in the early days that has enabled me to get to the point where I am able to recover and use this method. So it's not medical advice, I'm not a professional, and I want to make that clear because this is just what works for me, and I'm talking about it for my own personal benefit and expression. Hopefully some people will get something useful out of it, but there's quite a high likelihood that this may not work for you. It may work for you, it may be really useful information, and it's just me trying to figure out what I've been doing and put it down on paper and get like a clarified concept of this is my experience, this is how I've overcome it, or if not overcome it, how I'm learning to manage my experiences. So, next bit. Okay, so in the first part of my analysis of my own situation, self-reflection of how I've come to the point where I'm not in and out of hospital, I'm not unstable mentally, I'm still affected by the illness. I struggle to go out, I have agoraphobia, I have extreme paranoia on some very slight occasions now, but I've generally got a lid on managing my life within the context of I can cope with my circumstances as best I can using this approach. And I still need further therapy, I still need further treatment, and part of the reason I'm doing this channel and making these videos is to make a chronicle of how I further develop. So that's just something to bear in mind. Right. So the first thing I did was think about reframing these experiences. So hallucinating skillfully, reframing traumatic experiences. And I'm going to again read from the text, but then flesh it out with whatever pops into my head as is relevant. So it says the key difference between a mystic and a schizophrenic could perhaps be described as in the contextual referencing of the mind of the person experiencing it. As noted in a dialogue, and I draw this from a book called The Atman Project, written by Ken Wilber in the 1980s sometime. That's where the quote's from. As noted in a dialogue between a mystic known as Baba Ram Das and an institutionalized schizophrenic, this is from the Baba Ram Das, I said, do you think you're Christ, the Christ in pure consciousness? The schizophrenic says yes, and then he replies, well, I think I am too, and he looks at me and says, no, you don't understand. And then Baba Ram Das says, that's why they locked you up, you see. The nature of the schizophrenic is, now don't apply this grandiosely as it includes everyone, but I'm talking in general terms based on my own experience. The nature of the schizophrenic is one of an almost solipsistic denial of the significance of others and their potential for the same experiences, and a sort of, well, however intentional, masochistic arrogance that they're in some way more significant than society deems them materially. Thus they are tormented as a punishment for this significance, most notable in the form of delusions of grandeur experienced in psychosis and chronic schizophrenia sufferers alike. So to add to that, not all people are like this that suffer from schizophrenia. A lot of people manage their symptoms. There's a lot of people that don't. This is a generalization based on my own personal observation, not medical. And with the solipsistic denial, this can be flipped the other way around. There's a corresponding wisdom to that. It's like, and I'll go further into that. But hold on. Let me move on with what I'm going. But just to preface the idea that I don't think that everyone with schizophrenia is just arrogant or believe they're the only one of significance. And in fact, if anything, if they do believe that, it's because of a reactionary thing where it's quite rational to think that you're really significant when you hear everyone. If you say you experience thought broadcasting or voices that commentate on what you're doing, it gives you a sense of significance. It gives you a sense of like, and it's almost a rational response. Like if you were in a room and everyone was listening to what you were saying and they were clapping and applauding, or your perception of everyone around you was that quite genuinely that, like this is my own experience as well. When I experienced severe thought broadcasting, which is one of the reasons I suffer and still consider myself schizophrenic, because I struggle with it when I go out. It seems as though everyone around you is talking about you, and every voice you're hearing correlates that, and every sensation you experience has that. So it's not true arrogance. It's just reacting without clarity to what's genuinely being presented. So I don't think there's anything immoral or negative or genuinely arrogant on the part of the sufferer. So, right, I'll continue reading. I've often considered that the difference is as shown by Baba Ram Das. If I were to enjoy and have a healthy context for my hallucinatory experiences, perhaps I would be considered a visionary or a mystic rather than someone who is mentally ill. I'm not saying that's the case, but this is the basic argument for how it works. The key differences are this. The sufferer believes that they're the only one who can or does have this experience. I've seen this a lot. I've experienced it. That seems to be the case, which leads to isolation and perpetuation of these negative hallucinatory experiences. The sufferer experiences, and again my own experience and contact with other people who suffer from this illness, the sufferer experiences an inability to cognize and deal with appropriately within societal norms the effects of shifts into altered states of consciousness that are associated with hallucinations. As it is, I accept that and think that's basically why it's considered an illness, not just, oh, that person has novel experiences. It's because they can't cope with it. So that's why it's in this section. It's saying like I've met people personally who hallucinate, and they like it. They enjoy it. They consider it an evolution of their own psyche, or a God-given gift, or a beautiful thing. And there are some genuine, there's plenty of people that aren't just charlatans. There's genuinely people that believe they're psychic or have these transcendental experiences of connection with God or something. And I personally am one of them. But that's off topic slightly. But it's the inability to deal with it within societal norms, the ability to not go crazy or lose perspective or lose grounding. That's quite an important factor. And then 3, the sufferer does not have the insight into how to exert control over or digest the experiences in a progressive, beneficial, or more importantly, psychologically healthy and safe way. And I'm just going to keep reading now. Further from these insights, I begin to question the ways in which one could train themselves to have a different response to the traumatic experiences of the hallucinations, and came across an interesting line of questioning. 1. Who has charted these experiences before? 2. How do they contextualize these experiences in a healthy and beneficial way? 3. How can these approaches be applied safely to a patient in such a way that it creates a permanent or long-term change for the better? And 4. Can these approaches cure or at least significantly change the framing of the symptoms enough that one is no longer considered unwell? All of these things are useful. Like, I desire them to be the case. It may not be the case, but I've observed again, like I was saying before, like how you respond to these things determine whether you're considered insane or not. How easy it is for you to digest and then translate to other people these experiences in a rational, calm, and non-dangerous or violent or non-reactionary, overwhelmed way. That determines whether you're considered ill or not. And I've had this validated by people who have like medical professionals. I've been in dialogue with them about this. I can't give you concrete evidence of that, but that's just my own experience. So, and these questions led to the hypothesis of the following section and will be addressed in the order of which they were asked. So, moving on to the next section, I'll be back. Identifying pre-existing methodologies of understanding the psychotic experience in a healthy way. How to hallucinate. I began by looking at the cultural framework for understanding hallucinations and altered states of consciousness, namely religious and spiritual practices. These because that's where they're found in society where it's not considered unhealthy. These particular practices I found most relevant were Buddhist transcendental meditation, shamanic induction of hallucinogenic tryptamines or ritual practices, so taking drugs for a spiritual purpose, and then thus hallucinating them, like psychedelic drugs in particular, or just drugs in general, entheogens, anything that stimulates an altered state of consciousness that then triggers vivid hallucinations. And for a spiritual purpose in a ritualistic context. Magical, so with a K, ritual of occult and pagan communities. Kabbalistic practices, where you go into deep meditation, where you might disown parts of the self and embrace your divinity, and this can lead to hallucinations, altered states of consciousness, be very empowering. So again, that's quite an interesting one. And the common thread between all these practices is simple and hopefully self-evident. They all produce altered states of consciousness, and when practiced by experienced members of whichever particular group, they could arguably be described as hallucinations, and are a normal, healthy, and in fact sought-after experience that is a sign of progress rather than illness. This gap between the shaman, Zen master, rabbi or high priest and the schizophrenic sufferer of the modern Western civilization seemed profound, so quite large, and yet intimately linked. These were more or less the same types of experience, but the religious and spiritual practitioners are free, unmedicated, often revered in society, while the schizophrenic is closely monitored, medicated, and often, because of the consequences of their behaviour based on these actions, and I added that, but that is a good point, left at the bottom rungs of society through a lack of support or social stigmatization of both the Western psychological and social systems. Think about that for a sec. Cool. The idea I propose is the fundamental difference was how these experiences were managed and interpreted. I will later detail in the methodology section as to how these groups use their experiences for personal evolution and, of course, how they can be applied to the schizophrenia patient once they have entered a stable state. Now that's really important to me. I'm going to emphasize that, hopefully quite a lot, to make not only their experiences more manageable, but to gain insight and healing from the very thing that causes them to suffer. Next section. Framing an experience in a healthy, progressive fashion whilst maintaining intellectual self-honesty and not colluding with and particularly unhealthy delusions, or even delusions in general, misapprehensions of truth, not colluding with them, keeping true and safe. So we've seen examples in global culture of people who use hallucinations as a route to personal revelatory and evolutionary experience. But what separates them from the schizophrenic and the psychotic? You might have a different opinion about what my answer is here, but I'm sure by now you see what I'm going to say. This is just my opinion, again, not medical professional, not psychological professional. In fact, I'm not a professional in anything, it's a professional schizophrenic because they pay for me to sustain my existence because I'm so incapable of functioning in society, to be honest. So, but this is my understanding that contributes to what I'm talking about. Essentially, it comes down to social narrative. Who is telling the story, what the story implies, infers and instigates in the mind of the individual whom the story is about. For example, and this isn't always the case, but for example, the media portrays sufferers often as a violent and dangerously delusional people, but the statistical analysis of this perspective does not often and does not always correlate with objective reality. In fact, and quite often it's quite contrary to that, and I'll discuss that more further now. There are many people who are violent psychopaths who are not schizophrenic, and in fact it's quite often when they profess this, it's a deception to avoid punishment criminally, which leads to a lot of bias and skepticism towards sufferers, even when an actual psychotic disorder is presented, when it's present, like with imprisonment rather than institutionalization being more common due to the cost of hospitalization being more than imprisonment. I was told this by a criminal rights lawyer, and he sees a lot of people with mental health issues or severe illnesses that get put in prison because it's cheaper, it's more efficient for the system, and it worsens the problem. And he said to me, because I brought up a conversation with this man, I'm not going to name him, but he said to me with every confidence that despite my diagnosis, if I was put I'd be more likely to be put in prison, even if I was acting on the basis of my delusions or hallucinations. I would still be more likely to be put in prison because of the cost, because of the lower financial impact on the services because they're so overstrained. But that's just a little addendum again. So more often than not, based on my own research and experience, sufferers are statistically more likely to experience being subject to violence and abuse than they are to be the source of it, and there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that indeed those with a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia that suffer childhood trauma and abuse are more likely to have the genes associated with that, and thus the capacity for it triggered, and thus experience psychosis and the diagnosis of schizophrenia later life, usually between 19 and 25, based on my research. To be more specific, sufferers often have a history of being abused rather than being abusers, and even if they end up being abusive, they've usually are responding to abuse. It's been systemically programmed into them. And the violence portrayed in the media as commonplace amongst schizophrenics is perhaps more a misapprehension and social stigmatization than objective fact. Or perhaps they've been abused and they're reacting by being abusive because they don't know any better how to do it. But this point still stands that 9 times out of 10, schizophrenics aren't sociopaths. They're just delusional. They see things and respond to them. So this is a big argument. Like, if you saw what I saw, you would be terrified. You might even be violent because you're so scared. You might do any number of things that are seemingly insane, which, from the context of having experienced them, are actually rational responses. You're not crazy, you're responding rationally to irrational experiences and trying to navigate them. But it's just something I feel passionately about. So, to continue, this is paralleled succinctly in shamanic and tribal cultures as well as Buddhist spiritual practices and traditions. To elucidate my point, I would suggest researching the Dalai Lama's personal oracle and the status of shamans in tribal cultures, but I would give a brief, non-referenced analysis here. The most highly respected member of the Buddhist religious organization of Tibetan Buddhism, I don't know what that's called, I don't know what the sect's called, but the Dalai Lama has a personal oracle whom essentially hears voices and hallucinations, but has been trained to channel these experiences for the benefit of Buddhist traditional precognitive and divinatory practices to divine the future or to get psychic information. Look this up yourself, I didn't make this up. Someone in our society who would perhaps be institutionalized or regarded as a potentially dangerous person advises a global religious group and organization which has power and wealth and respect in our communities and ever more so in modern society on the future events or current events or telepathic or psychic information based on these supposedly psychotic experiences. Similarly, in shamanic and tribal cultures, it is often considered a great honor and an initiation into a higher state when one begins to have what otherwise would be described as psychotic or schizophrenic symptoms. Yet these people are figureheads of whole communities and considered to be of incredible value to the community as they're purportedly able to communicate with the spirit world and do great works of healing, magic and travel and alternate dimensions and be able to bring back psychical abilities and insights to their community. Now I'd further add to this that these people with training and correctly framed respect for the experiences they're having. So they don't become mental, they don't become, to use a terrible term that I hate using, but they don't become schizophrenic and then suddenly have these powers. They learn through the schizophrenic experience to have these abilities. By overcoming the illness, and we'll come back to this later, but by overcoming the challenges of the illness, these abilities appear, and it's only with the support of their community. It's only with the framing that it's healthy or useful or productive. So, we see the power of both acceptance and stigmatization in affecting the cohesion of an individual into their society or community. By a simple reframing of the experiences at the early stage of having them, one can become an asset rather than a burden or a threat. And I would further argue, and do so throughout, that it is simple as that, fundamentally. Changing our perspective is the key to healing schizophrenia, at least with any sort of progressive way. However, all that being said, it is not to say that there aren't potential dangers, and a profoundly strong and supportive yet objective ethical and moral grounding in both the individual and the community around them, as well as a close psychological monitoring, again, self and community around you, and maintenance is required for this reframing to be healthy. One must facilitate and strictly monitor their rationality while engaging in hallucinations, whether through choice, meditation, trance induction, or hallucinogenic use. Not going to lie, partly how I achieved this perspective and some of my vague recovery. Or imposition, such as spiritual crisis, emergency, schizophrenia, and acute or long-term psychosis. So, naturally occurring, whether it be good or bad, naturally occurring hallucinations that aren't deliberately induced. It is of the utmost importance to critically analyse and digest one's experiences before applying them to society or deeming them significant outside of one's own value system. Does that make sense? It's not simply a case of you have these experiences, thus you're suddenly a shaman or a healthy, valuable member of the community. No. It's digesting them. It's how you react to the stimuli, how you interpret it, how the framework within which you respond to these potentially terrifying or glorifying phenomena. That's really important. And this, in itself, requires a well-trained and quite strict adherence to intellectual self-honesty and the scientific, as best I understand it, methodology of objective analysis of data, or in this case taking into account very strictly the variables of experience like context and content, which I will discuss further later on, but to briefly discuss now. If you're on acid, for example, and you're at a rave, and there's horrible things going on around you in the context of what you desire. If you're out of sync with your environment, for example, so you could be suffering violent abuse or negativity, or you could just be paranoid, or you could be interpreting things as violent abuse and negativity, or whatever context. If you're not in alignment with your internal environment whilst you're hallucinating and the external one, it can be extremely traumatic. And the context of, like, what does it mean to you? How do you digest those experiences? It's not simply a case of I hear a voice telling me something negative about myself, and thus that must be either objective reality or false. It's like that is a source of information, even if that information is just that I feel negative about my appearance, thus I'm using an internally modelled abuser's voice to, for example, which is commonly an explanation for some of these auditory hallucinations, then you might end up interpreting it in entirely different ways based on your own specific experiences and what you've been exposed to. So, it is possible to facilitate this in a software using various psychological techniques and what I would personally term spiritual technologies, which I will discuss in the next section. Ensuring that a measurable and repeatable method of doing this is intractable and thus well grounded and consistent in the individual, and this is where it becomes useful, means that even though throughout the most potentially traumatic experiences there can be an undertone of research and inquisition, if you're able to stay calm while you're hallucinating, it's fascinating. Doesn't always happen for me, but the more I learn to do it, the more it's interesting. Even if I'm seeing a demon, which is something I see visions of demons, and they're in the room, or they're animating people, or they're doing all these crazy things, and it could be terrifying. But then if I'm going, whether this is real or not, how I react to it dictates the nature of the experience, but to a certain extent. But also, like, if I'm not afraid, it's fascinating. It's remarkable, and it can teach me about my perception of reality. So if I believe demons can exist, I'll see demons. If I believe in angels are the most powerful force, I'll see angels. In some of my experiences I've had, like I've spoken to Christ, I've spoken to a vision of Krishna, I've spoken to God, which manifested as an eye, like the Cat's Eye Nebula, whatever it looks like. I can't think what the actual name of it, but the nebula that looks like an eye. I've seen a vision of that I had telepathic communication with, and all of this it's fascinating, and sometimes and quite often now these things provide me with useful insight. I'm not perfect, I'm not better, I haven't stopped having these experiences, but I'm learning to stay calm. And meditations and the practices that I'm going to discuss next are of big big part of me not being in and out of hospital all the time. A big part of me being not locked up, me not considered dangerous. So this can facilitate a sense of rationality and self-governance during the experiences that allows the sufferer to rationalize and categorize their perceptions, and thus have more, which is what I was just talking about, and thus have more control over how they relate to what they perceive, even if they cannot yet, or never perhaps, control what they perceive at this point. So that's the end of this section. I'll be back. Right, so I've had a cigarette, I've had a calm down. That last topic, the last section, is very important to me because it's humiliating being schizophrenic. It's debilitating. It's frustrating. Not being understood, not being treated with respect because I'm not able to control my behaviour. When I'm in the psychotic state, I believe I'm acting rationally. I'm reacting to the stimuli, and it's so compelling that it's almost impossible to behave any other way. And I feel very strongly about it, and that's why my tone was quite probably, hopefully not, but probably quite agitated while discussing that last section of it. But it's a hopeful, and it's a passion. This is my passion. This is almost the entire crux of my existence. So obviously I'm going to be passionate about it. And it's also the way in which I've suffered most and grown the most. So I have both passion and anger and sadness and hope and joy, all accompanied in this. So that's just why I was agitated. So to move on to the next section, adapting and applying the elements of the processes that are useful and applicable in a therapeutic and safe way, healing yourself and others. So to apply this new knowledge and the importance of perspective itself, we now need to analyse how and why those that have progressive and beneficial effects from hallucinations practice and control or otherwise induce these states, and then create a therapeutic form of these practices that can safely be applied to schizophrenia patients. So creating a new framework of understanding so as to reframe the patient and therapist's perspective so as not to reinforce a destructive cycle of belief. The cure is the illness. The illness is the cure. Which is so much to say is, rather than trying to stop these experiences from happening, like I discussed in the introductory video in the podcast, rather than trying to destroy the experience and find them unacceptable, is to do something useful with them. And like 9 times out of 10, when I hear about people that are way more advanced in their recovery than me, it's because they stopped rejecting the voices. They negotiated with them. They entered into dialogue with them. They realized that the longer you fight these things and try to stop them existing, the more power they have, and the more individuality they have, the greater their strength, the greater their power over you, the greater significance you give them as unpleasant or pleasant. Like even being attracted to the voices, it perpetuates them. And the same thing goes for auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, anything like that. Like most of my perception, I feel like it looks like I'm underwater when I focus on it. I just looking at my hands, it looks really trippy in the camera. With that visual hallucination going on, like I look around the room now and I can see almost like electro-digital energy. I don't know whether that's real, but I know that I experience it. So what am I supposed to do with that? Like try and block it out, spend the rest of my life crucifying myself with negative dialogue, a negative narrative about what this is. Instead of trying to integrate it and accept it, I reject it. And it's very much like in obsessive compulsive disorder or things like that, where the longer it's like all your shadow work as well. The longer you repress and reject and try and force these things away, like when you're pushing your hand, it slaps you in the face as soon as you move it. But then once it's done it, there's no more pressure, and then you can relax your hand. And I know it's again, like I said in the other video, it's a crude metaphor, but it's kind of like that. The more investment you have in stopping yourself having these experiences, the more prevalent they become. That's why you get the incurable nature. And I often argue that just embracing the experiences, whilst you need support, it can be horrible, but the cure is the illness is the cure. Like, the only way to overcome these situations is to do something with that information, so it's not just bombarding you all the time and overwhelming you and crushing you and debilitating you, and just go, alright, fucking bring it, give me the hallucinations. And like, even in my own experience, as soon as I have the courage to go, like, I get a voice going in my head, and I'm just like, what do you want? Talk to me. I'm here. I want to listen. And eventually that's gone from being an aggressed thing to just like, I'll hear a voice and I'll be like, oh, that's interesting, thank you. And then no more recurrence of voices. I still get thought broadcasting when I'm out and about, which is accompanied by voices and stuff like that. But in my own life, or when I'm on one-to-one dialogues with people, or like even now, like, I'm hearing mild voices because I'm on my own, but I'm able to just accept them. And so instead of going, no, what is this horrible thing torturing me? I'm going like, yeah, okay, thank you. I'm sure I'll find something useful with that. Sometimes I'll even say, like, quite sincere thanks. Like, prayer is useful for that. Like, talking to myself in my head, which is what prayer is. You send intention into yourself, into whether you believe that's to God or whether anything like that, or however you interpret it. Prayer itself is thinking something with an intention, which is submitting to an external thing. And it's like telepathy. It's like, it feels like prayer or telepathy. I'm in dialogue with parts of myself, or what I genuinely perceive to be externalized beings, like God or the devil or demons or angels or any of these fantastically complicated things I experience. As soon as I stop resisting them, they stop happening. And it's just a process of slowly overcoming them. And even if they don't stop happening, realizing that they can become a source of information. And that's the methodology bit. And I'm going to end this video just now. But if you're intrigued, if you want to know the specifics of how I did this, not just what I want to do with it or what created the solution, but like specifically how I did it in my own life, as best I've got to the point I have, I've got like all that left to say. So there will be a part 2. So thank you for listening to my agitated, perhaps narcissistic dialogue, and see you in the next video.